which in the spirit of the conference's theme of rebellion will be given for the first time by not one, but a pair of eminent speakers. It is particularly meaningful to have the lecture given here today on the Hollins campus, the home of the journal Children's Literature, founded by Francelia Butler, and the repository of her papers. Hollins also hosts its own graduate student conference yearly to memorialize Professor Butler. While her influence has been felt worldwide and throughout the discipline, Francelia Butler has left quite a legacy to Hollins University. In Francelia Butler's New York Times obituary of September 1998, she was recognized as a late-blooming academic of such passionate, unorthodox ways that she has been credited with almost single-handedly transforming the study of children's literature from a stepchild of library science into a recognized academic discipline. For some of our younger members and scholars who did not have the privilege of knowing Francelia Butler, I'd like to commend to you the wonderful history of Butler's career that is contained in the first Francelia Butler Memorial Lecture given in the conference by Gillian Adams in 1999 and is printed in the CHLA Quarterly, Volume 25, Number 4. When the organizing committee for this conference began our meetings, one of our first questions was who should give the lecture in 2011. Whose work suited the theme, revolt, rebellion, protest, change and insurrection in children's literature? It seemed that we spoke with one voice when the names Julia, Mickenberg, and Phil Nell tumbled from 9 or 10 pairs of lips. Of course, the next question was, can we have two instead of the conventional one? As you see, despite the unanimity, we were all about insurrection and transformative change. And Mickenberg and Nell were inextricably linked as a pair in our collective thoughts by the title of their edited collection, Tales for Little Rebels, a collection of radical children's literature. In their introduction to the collection, Mickenberg and Nell state, the very idea of radical children's literature may be surprising because we do not commonly think of connections between children's literature and politics. Their collection, their other scholarship, and no doubt today's lecture will have opened up a number of new ways to talk about children, childhood, and the political sphere. Julia L. Mickenberg is Associate Professor in the Department of American Studies at the University of Texas, Austin, and an NEH Fellow. She's the author of Learning from the Left, Children's Literature, the Cold War, and Radical Politics in the United States, 2006, which won the Grace Abbott Book Prize from the Society for the History of Children and Youth, the Children's Literature Association's Book Award, the Pacific Coast Branch Award from the American Historical Association, and the Hamilton Book Award. She is also editor with Lynn Malone of the Oxford Handbook of Children's Literature, published this year. Philip Nell is professor in the English department at Kansas State University, where he directs the graduate program in children's literature. His books include Keywords for Children's Literature, co-edited with Lissa Paul, 2011, The Annotated Cat, Under the Hats of Seuss and His Cats, 2007, Dr. Seuss, American Icon, 2004, The Avant-Garde and American Postmodernity, Small Incisive Shocks, and J.K. Rowling's Harry Potter novels, A Reader's Guide. Forthcoming books will include The Purple Crayon and A Hole is to Dig, The Lives of Crockett Johnson and Ruth Krauss. When we return to the description of Francelia Butler as passionate, unorthodox, and transformative, we know that her legacy is imbued in the brilliant work of the two scholars we will hear today. Please welcome Julie Mickenberg and Philip Nell.
Thanks very much for inviting us. I hope our voices will carry well enough with the mic and distance that it is. It's a great honor to be asked to give the Francelia Butler Lecture. And
thank you especially for that generous introduction. Thank you to Amanda Cockrell, who's been incredibly welcoming, making us comfortable. Thank you so much for all of you for being here.
And we should say that this was originally 50 pages long. We cut a lot.
And unfortunately, we cut some things that we wish we had kept. The handout that you all have is a list of the books that we'll be talking about in the order that we're talking about them. Unfortunately, we didn't include the things that we're not talking about, but there may be time for discussing that at the end.
Yes, fortunately, the cuts mean that we should be done in a little over 50 minutes. That at least is the plan, so there should be time for questions at the end. Well, focusing on literature for children, published in the last decade, as well as the incentives and disincentives for writing, publishing, and distributing this literature, we this morning will argue that literature for children, as well as being a tool of enforcement, has been and continues to be an important vehicle for ideas that challenge the status quo and promote social justice, environmental stewardship, and greater acceptance of differences.
We have looked for works that cast aside many of the traditional assumptions about what is appropriate for children, that acknowledge pressing concerns of the day as fundamentally relevant to children's lives, and that refuse to whitewash difficult truths, but at the same time display literary and aesthetic quality and recognize the cognitive and emotional capacities of children. Radical children's literature models and encourages activism by children and as well as adults, and exposes unjust uses of power.
Children's literature needs to address the reality that the white, middle-class, all-American norm is a myth, and that it is impossible and unethical to shut children off from the world outside U.S. borders. Neither children nor literature for them can be extricated from politics. By choice or by default, children often get drawn into the adult worlds of politics, violence, and power struggles.
At the same time, as many papers at this conference have demonstrated, children's literature, while to some extent marked by greater levels of public scrutiny than literature for adults, has historically been and remains a realm for expressing hopes for a better world and launching subtle critiques of the existing social order. This is so both because of generic conventions and the utopian dimensions of childhood as a concept.
Just as the word radical derives from the Latin radicalis, forming the root, we need books that address the roots of many flawed assumptions about children, as well as the causes. You've been a wonderful audience, thank you. As well as the causes of inequality, injustice, and exploitation around the world. But how likely are children to find such books? George Nicholson, literary agent and 50-year veteran of the children's book business, observes that today, quote, anything perceived as difficult is avoided at all costs by the major publishers, and that's because every penny is being watched and the dragons of censorship are stronger than ever in my memory, he says. He describes fear of offending sales and marketing, the naysayers and the chains who won't touch anything too controversial for retail.
Beyond the reticence of major publishers, recent trends in education inhibit the production of radical children's books. The No Child Left Behind Act's emphasis on accountability has dramatically increased standardized testing, draining money away from school library budgets. State testing expenditures practically tripled between 1995 and 2000, from $141 million to $390 million. Further, pressure to prepare children for standardized tests limits students' opportunities for unstructured reading during the day. Educational politics and policies likewise shape the range of subject matter treated in children's literature. As one of the single buyers of textbooks, my home state of Texas exerts an enormous influence upon textbook publishing. As a result, right-wing members of the Texas Board of Education have not only made Texas history standards into a national joke, but have effectively transformed the teaching of history throughout the country. Curricular changes may create greater incentives for school librarians to purchase books that offer perspectives not found in school textbooks, but they also contribute to a general climate of conservatism in schools that encourages both teachers and librarians to steer clear of controversial topics and perspectives. Educational politics in the United States affect publishing in the rest of the world as well, because the U.S. market is so large. Patsy Aldana, the founder and president of Toronto's Brownwood Books, which publishes some of the most radical and acclaimed children's books today, has found, for instance, that demand in the United States for Spanish language children's books, as opposed to bilingual texts, has diminished dramatically over the last 10 years as a result of anti-immigrant sentiment in the US. Likewise, books published in Canada have increasingly been disqualified for various American-based book awards and book lists, which Aldana attributes to fears in the United States of all things foreign. On the other hand, the press's acquisitions are not driven solely by market potential, as is the case for most US trade publishers. Block grants that support Canadian authors mean Groundwood can publish more controversial books, and the press has made a niche for itself doing so. The proliferation of awards and book lists that focus upon the experiences of marginalized groups, social issues, or social justice has had some impact on the production of children's literature, although the actual impact on sales isn't clear. The longest running award for books promoting tolerance, social justice, and peace is the Jane Addams Book Award. Susan Griffith, a member of the Addams Award Committee, cites the award's importance in identifying and promoting, quote, vivid, compelling stories of resistance, injustice, and social action that help children understand the power and limits of their own empathy, and invite readers to think creatively and humanely about injustice and conflict. Griffith does believe that the award is an incentive to writers. Several have stated that they had long hoped to win it, but she thinks it unlikely that the award has any real effect upon sales. On the other hand, awards create publicity, and publicity can generate controversy, which often affects sales, though it can also impact access when controversial books get removed from libraries and curricula.
At the outset, we want to point out that subversive children's books may be published by the very powers that such books are arguably undermining. What Norbert Elias has called the civilizing process is largely a process of children learning to submit to authority. On some very basic level, radical children's literature is radical if it calls into question accepted understandings of childhood, such as how much a child gets to know, how much power a child gets to have. Through humor, two new books critique unjust or foolish rulers and the processes by which they maintain power.
Slated for publication this fall by Disney's Hyperion Books, Mac Barnett's Mustache features a terrible, but terribly handsome, king who spent every royal day admiring his royal reflection and not doing much else, as the kingdom's roads and playgrounds fall into disrepair. In response to his subjects' protests, the king responds by putting up posters of himself. Citizens paint mustaches on them. Disingenuously promising amnesty for the culprit, the king asks, who has painted the mustaches? But when every member of the kingdom raises their hand, he sends them all to jail, which requires expanding the jail until it encompasses everyone and everything in the kingdom but him. At which point the king, coming to his senses, or feeling left out, reached for his royal paintbrush and painted a mustache on his own face. That may be the Disney ending, for it's hard to imagine a real ruler being so sensible.
And the very silly mayor, political cartoonist Tom Tomorrow, stages an absurdist drama of what happens when elected officials abuse authority and neither the media nor citizens examine their policies critically. The mayor decrees that police officers should wear clown costumes with big red noses and goofy clown shoes, that firefighters should put out fires with peanut butter instead of water, and that all houses should be painted green with green and purple stripes. The press fails to expose these ideas as ludicrous, and people go along with them. Until Sparky the Penguin exposes their foolishness and leads a crowd to the mayor's office. Sparky asks, or excuse me, the mayor asks, why didn't someone tell me this sooner? And he hires Sparky as an advisor, and the book portrays, if the book portrays authority figures as unusually receptive to criticism, it does emphasize the need to speak up when you see silly policies being pursued. And this year has given us many reminders of this fact. In Tunisia, Bahrain, Egypt, Syria, Wisconsin, Michigan, many other places. We might wonder what kind of models do children's books offer for such collective action. And Toby Speed and Barry Root's Brave Potatoes, Potatoes Unite, and knock murderous Chef Hackemup into a big vat of soup. And liberate the surviving vegetables. In addition to confirming some children's suspicions about vegetables, the book offers a comic but affirmative lesson in the power of subjectivity.
They're revolting.
They are revolting, yes. Andrea Davis Pinckney and Brian Pinckney's Sit-In, How Four Friends Stood Up by Sitting Down, offers a history lesson in that same power. A well-designed, dynamic rendering of the lunch counter sit-ins of the early 1960s. It dramatizes how the Greensboro-Woolworth lunch counter sit-in sparked more sit-ins and protests in other states. And the fact that it was kids who wouldn't budge adds to the boldness of sit-in's message. Even so, it has become less controversial to recall the victories of the civil rights movement than it has to recall those of the labor movement. Reflecting the decades-long decline in union membership in the United States, relatively few recent children's books have celebrated labor organizing. Despite the ostensible pro-labor message of the popular Click-Clack Moo, Cows That Type, as Kimberly Jack points out, that book can as easily be interpreted as trivializing unions as supporting them.
A more explicitly pro-labor book, That's Not Fair, No Es Justo, Emma Tenayuca's Struggle for Justice, La Lucha de Emma Tenayuca por la Justicia, celebrates the leadership of Mexican-American labor activist Emma Tenayuca in the 1930s. Co-written by Tenayuca's niece, Cheryl Tenayuca, and Carmen Tifola, the book has poor production values and is more a tribute than a work of literature. But it is significant as one of the few recent books about labor and about Mexican-American activism. While That's Not Fair lacks wide distribution, highly conventionalized series books can sometimes be important outlets for radical themes. Indeed, one of the best books we've discovered about the labor movement is the final novel in the American Girl series featuring Rebecca Rubin, a 10-year-old daughter of Russian Jewish immigrants living on the Lower East Side in 1914. Changes for Rebecca focuses upon the intolerable working conditions in the factory that employs Rebecca's cousin Joseph and Uncle Jacob, recent immigrants from Russia, their involvement with the Garment Workers Union, and their participation in a strike. When the coat factory workers strike, Jacob and Joseph are arrested as agitators and fired. Rebecca speaks at a Labor Day picnic several days later, interrupted when a company goon throws a stone at her, knocking her out. But the story ends happily because her uncle, with Rebecca's help, finds a better job as a carpenter. Rebecca explicitly the Jewish concept of tikkun olam, or healing the world, to justify joining the picket line. It is striking that the one Jewish character in the American Girl series sets up radical labor activism as an integral and positive part of Jewish identity, as against the right-wing association of Jewish activists with foreign agitators and Jewish resistance to this stereotype.
Although children's literature often challenges xenophobia, American bigotry may be undergoing a resurgence. In May 2009, anti-immigrant vigilantes gunned down 9-year-old Brisiana Flores and her father in Arizona. The following April, the same state passed a law ordering the police to arrest anyone of whom they had, quote, reasonable suspicion, end quote, of being in the country illegally, thus inviting racial profiling of people who look illegal. Just this past March, Representative Peter King of New York held hearings on what he called, quote, the extent of radicalization of American Muslims, end quote. He is currently the chair of the House Homeland Security Committee. Representative King and his supporters might want to read, they called themselves the KKK, the birth of an American terrorist group. In it, they would learn not only of the Klan's use of terrorism and murder, but of more subtle ways that white Southerners prevented black citizens from voting. Reading of the violence that Grand Wizard Nathan Bedford Forrest promoted against American citizens remind us that alleged Christians make capable terrorists too. In fact, terrorists who are celebrating. Forrest's name adorns high schools in Tennessee and Florida. Georgia, Tennessee, and Alabama have monuments dedicated to Forrest, and there are towns, parks, and buildings named for him. Of course, one of the best ways to challenge bigotry is to expose its false assumptions. a lavishly illustrated nonfiction work, and actually one of the most beautiful books you'll probably ever see. Kadir Nelson's We Are the Ship conveys the histories of athletes who denied participation in the all-white major league to display their talents in the low-paying but high-performing Negro leagues. Nelson makes history come alive by creating the feeling of an oral interview in the text. When discussing the fact that many ball players came from Latin America, Nelson's narrator says of Cristobal Torriente, if he had been a couple of shades lighter, he could have played in the majors. Major league owners would take a Cuban before they would a Negro. Guess they didn't know slave ships stopped down on those islands, too. Australian artist Sean Tan's The Arrival makes visible the experience of foreignness. Using language to align the book's reader with a recent emigre, Tan invites us to share the bewilderment, the anxiety, and the utter strangeness of being foreign. As Tan's New Arrival does, we see signs and maps printed with a linguistic system we cannot comprehend. Tan's characters communicate with eyes, hands, faces, gestures, and other movements that bridge gaps between cultures. Following the post-9/11 suspicion of people from other countries, The Arrival goes against the grain of both U.S. and Australian policies.
Narratives set in such foreign settings expose American children to challenges faced by children all over the world and undermine assumptions about the naturalness of American middle-class childhood. They can also produce feelings of empathy, as well as sensitivity to abuse of authority. The composition by Chilean writer Antonio Scarmetta explores the tension between its protagonist Pedro's childish impulses and his growing awareness of the political struggle in which his family is implicated. When Pedro asks his friend Daniel why the police have taken his father away, Daniel replies, "My father is against the dictatorship." When Pedro asks his own father if he is against the dictatorship, an affirmative answer prompts Pedro to ask, "Will they take you to jail too?" Back at school, a man in a military uniform announces that all the children are to write a composition on
what you and your parents do from the moment you get home from school and work, which friends come over, what they talk about, what they say about the television programs you watch.
When Pedro tells his parents, who avidly listen to foreign radio programs each night, what he had to write about, they are terrified. But Pedro reads his essay out loud to them and has said that he plays soccer every day after school, and after supper his parents sit and play chess until Pedro goes to bed. Scarmetta writes, Pedro looked up and saw that his parents were smiling.
Well,
said his father.
We better buy a chess set.
Pedro has learned to lie to protect his family. Also using a child's perspective to heighten the tale's emotional impact in Nappy, Nappy Goes to the Mountain, and Nappy Makes a Village, the Zapatista writer and artist team of Antonio Ramirez and Domi critique the Mexican government's repression of indigenous peoples. The books combine subtle commentary on politics with calls to action. In Nappy Makes a Village, the building of a government dam uproots a Mazateca community. Nappy recalls the advice her grandfather gave when her father had considered going to the U.S. because the lands we'd left behind were good for growing things, while the new lands that the bad government had given us were all stony. Her grandfather had insisted.
For us Indians, the best thing to do is to resist, to stay alive, and to stay together. Don't go.
A co-founder with Domi of the Colectivo Calajero, a group dedicated to expressing the political thought of the left through art, Ramirez dedicates Nappy Goes to the Mountain to the boys and girls, children of landless farmers, the victims of capitalist greed. Deborah Ellis's award-winning novel, The Breadwinner, directly addresses children's role in public life and politics in its depiction of an 11-year-old Afghan girl living under Taliban rule. The novel's reception also demonstrates how a radical work can be appropriated for very different aims. Published in the spring of 2001, the book became a bestseller after the events of September 11th raised interest in and concern about Afghanistan and the Taliban. The daughter of educated parents who are secretly critical of the Taliban, Parvana must cut her hair and dress as a boy to support the family after her father's imprisonment. Parvana's defiance and bravery are striking, and she finds it liberating to be out and about with nothing covering her head or her face. Ellis's work in an Afghan refugee camp in Pakistan inspired the series, and she donates all royalties to Women for Women in Afghanistan. But despite Ellis's commitment to the subject she depicts, the Breadwinner trilogy was used to justify the US-led invasion of Afghanistan. As Aslam Sensoy and Elizabeth Marshall point out, in exposing female suffering under the Taliban, the books feed the notion that all Muslim girls and women need to be saved by the West. Ellis's work has also generated controversy for its positive portrayal of Muslims, and Palestinians in particular. Ellis's Three Wishes, Palestinian and Israeli Children Speak, offers a strikingly even-handed depiction of the suffering that all children experience in a war-torn region. While it includes voices of both Palestinian and Israeli children, it lists the names of the 429 children under the age of 18 killed between 2000 and 2004. There's actually many more pages on the list. And most of those names are clearly Palestinian. The Canadian Jewish Congress successfully removed Three Wishes from the shelves of elementary school libraries in Toronto and York. At stake was the age appropriateness of a book that records the words and feelings of both Palestinian and Israeli children. Rejecting the idea that the book is age inappropriate, the Globe and Mail's Rick Salutin wrote, "The world our kids live in is age inappropriate." They have to accept. Anne Laurel Carter's The Shepherd's Granddaughter, written from the perspective of a Palestinian teenager who sees an adjacent Israeli settlement gradually taking over her family's land and livelihood, generated similar controversy. Although censorship efforts ultimately failed, Brownwood, along with members of the Jane Addams Award Committee, which had honored Carter's story, had to dedicate months to fighting. And Eldana suspects few publishers would have the will or energy to do so.
Positive portrayals of Islam, like that found in The Shepherd's Granddaughter, are rare. Indeed, the very fact that Palestinian characters and perspectives have been appearing in children's literature marks a change, according to Betsy Bird, children's librarian at the New York Public Library. Leaving aside the more volatile issue of Palestinian and Israeli relations, a number of recent books have featured positive Muslim characters.
Nazarene's Secret School, a picture book and true story from Afghanistan by Jeanette Winter, reinforces a Save the Muslim Girl mentality, but like Winter's Librarian of Basra, it demonstrates the power that a heroic individual can have when confronting injustice.
Less explicitly political is Mohideen El-Abad's The Illustrator's Notebook. In a series of illustrated autobiographical vignettes, the Egyptian artist and writer shares his insights into living and drawing. At times, his reminiscences offer explicit political engagement, as when he recalls his childhood realization that flesh pink did not describe his own skin. However, many entries simply offer thoughtful reflections on human experience. Islam is portrayed in the book as a fulfilling and positive aspect of El-Abad's life. Even in English, one reads the illustrator's notebook from right to left, which denaturalizes the Western way of reading.
Both of these books confirm the lesson that is likewise found in Yuri Shulvitz's How I Learned Geography, Amy Lee Tighe's A Place Where the Sunflowers Grow, James Rumford's Silent Music, and Peter C's The Wall, Growing Up Behind the Iron Curtain, which is the power of the imagination to transcend the horrors of the present.
Books advocating international understanding and criticizing abuse of authority are implicitly promoting peace. Books that explicitly argue for peace are inevitably about war. David Cully and Sergei Bloch's The Enemy, Nicholas Dubon's A Brave Soldier, Walter Dean Myers and Andrew Falcone's Patrol, and Ahmad Akbarpour and Morteza Zahidi's Goodnight Commander offer variants on the claim that soldiers of opposing sides have more in common with each other than they do with those who sent them into battle.
In Patrol, an American soldier, the narrator, and Vietnamese soldiers see each other, recognize that they are both young and scared, turn away, and do not shoot. Both The Enemy and A Brave Soldier feature soldiers who would rather be at home. In the latter, set in the First World War, Canadian volunteer Frank sits in his hole, wondering if the Germans also had homes and families waiting for them in Germany. At the book's end, he leans on crutches at a comrade's gravesite and wonders what had happened to the young Germans whose voices he used to hear on the other side of no man's land.
The Enemy offers a much more blunt, incisive critique of war, showing how propaganda conditions both sides to fight each other. Beginning on a battlefield with 2 foxholes, the book focuses on one soldier who has a manual telling him the enemy, quote, is a wild beast who, quote, will kill all our families and pets, burn down our forests, even poison our water. One night, he creeps over to the enemy's hole to kill him so that he can end the war and, quote, go home to my family. He reaches the hole to find the enemy gone, but there are pictures of his family and, quote, a manual just like mine, but in this one, the enemy has my face. Realizing that the enemy must be in his hole, our soldier decides to throw him a bottle with the message, let's end the war now. The final page shows 2 bottles arcing through the air, each about to land in the other soldier's hole. Goodnight, Commander, and Stephanie Joris's pictures for Lewis Carroll's Jabberwocky exceed the enemy in the intensity of their anti-war message. Their critique is grounded in bodies in pain and in war's effect on children. Setting Carroll's verse amidst images of government propagandizing and wounded soldiers, Jabberwocky becomes a sarcastic, caustic commentary on war. When the vorpal blade went snicker-snack, Joris spatters the page and the soldier with blood. When the text exults, come to my arms, my beamish boy, oh, fragiste, colluculae. The speaker of these words is a wounded soldier in a hospital bed, catheters protruding from his body. The book's final images are a funeral, followed by children playing with a decapitated animal, implying that war has normalized violence for young people. Goodnight, Commander offers a qualified sense of hope, but it also probes psychological wounds more deeply. Having lost both his mother and a leg in the Iran-Iraq War, a small Iranian boy spends his days talking with a photo of his mother, while restaging his trauma with toy soldiers and imaginary enemies. Wearing his prosthetic leg, the boy encounters the imagined, quote, enemy commander, and learns that he too was missing a leg, and he too enlisted to avenge his mother's death. The two become friendly. Our narrator loans his enemy the prosthetic leg for the evening, and then calls,
Cease fire! Cease fire!
but the tale doesn't end there. The boy, having failed to avenge his mother, feels ashamed. But the photo of his mother congratulates him and tells him,
Good night.
the boy may bear emotional and physical wounds, but he has at least learned war's futility.
If peace can only come from citizens of the world, so environmental degradation and climate change demand that we think beyond our own borders and our own historical moment. Children are growing up with recycling, organic foods, and green products, yet few books grapple with the enormity of the problems at hand or the real changes necessary to halt or reverse growing trends. At their most harmful, green books may breed self-righteous complacency about environmental issues. Just recycle, and that's all you need to do. Even books that do acknowledge the problem of overflowing landfills can make recycling an end in itself and foster a congratulatory mindset. In contrast, truly radical books about the environment don't just advocate recycling. They advocate consuming less and explain to children the true consequences of pollution, resource depletion, decreasing biodiversity, unrestricted development, and lost animal habitats. One such book, How We Know What We Know About Our Changing Climate, Scientists and Kids Explore Global Warming, explains human causes of global climate change and encourages children to become involved, not just in making lifestyle changes, but in educating others and in pressing for regulation. Books like this begin with the assumption that children want to help the environment. Others attempt to use the appeal of popular series or imply narrative logic that may captivate readers less inclined toward activism. Just Grace Goes Green and Judy Moody Saves the World may bring new recruits to the environmental movement, but risk presenting it as just another hobby. Going green and saving the world can become activities on par with Judy Moody declaring independence and Just Grace walking the dog or having a snack attack. We need books that present models of buoyant, crusading, militant political action, to use John Dewey's words, and of action that gets to the heart of the matter. By showing what real people have done, biography shows children that real change is possible. Recent books on Jacques Cousteau by Jennifer Byrne and Dan Yaccarino tell of Cousteau's activism against water pollution. As Manfish notes, Cousteau began filming his underwater adventures to make people aware of how humans threaten ocean environments. Emphasizing both Cousteau's influence with the world's power brokers and his commitment to young people, Burns' book concludes,
Jacques spoke to presidents, to kings and queens, to people all over the earth, asking them to help save our oceans, our planet.
He also
Spoke to children. Jacques dreamed that someday it would be you, exploring worlds never seen, never imagined, worlds that are now yours to discover, to care for, and to love.
two excellent recent picture books teach children about the American-educated Kenyan Wangari Maathai, winner of the Nobel Peace Prize for her Greenbelt movement, in which close to 100,000 women have planted trees, initiated a barter system to support farmers, and protested development and deforestation, often at great risk to themselves. Planting the Trees of Kenya, the story of Wangari Maathai, won the Jane Addams Book Award in 2009, but arguably Wangari's Trees of Peace is an even more radical book, showing Maathai's direct defiance of developers and the Kenyan government in her efforts.
If most American children will recognize Jacques Cousteau or Wangari Maathai as extraordinary, they may be able to better identify with Diane Wilson, a fourth-generation East Texas shrimper whose activism Molly Bang chronicled in nobody particular, one woman's effort to save the bays, a woman's fight to save the bays, I should say. A real-life example of how individuals can resist environmental destruction, taking on giant corporations, and working for the common good.
Inviting the child reader to identify with the activist character, other books model real or fictional child activism. Sarah Pennypacker's Sparrow Girl takes a real historical event as the basis for a story of the fictional Ming Li's heroism. In 1958, Mao declared war on sparrows in order to save the nation's wheat crop. At the government's behest, people posted scarecrows and shot, captured, or poisoned sparrows. The results were disastrous. Destroying the sparrows allowed locusts and other insects to thrive, and the wheat crop suffered immeasurably. In Sparrow Girl, despite her brother's insistence that
Our leaders' plans are always perfect.
Ming Li embarks on a private campaign to save the sparrows, with her brother eventually joining her. Overhearing village elders meeting to decide how to deal with the insects that are destroying their crops, Ming Li admits she's been secretly hiding sparrows in the village barn. She becomes a hero, and in the words of Ming Li's father,
A true farmer.
in the context of contemporary American culture, particularly radical are books that critique consumption. The Dumpster Diver takes the idea of reusing to its logical extreme. Several children of different races help their adult neighbor, Steve, on his dumpster diving adventures. After hosing off and sorting the garbage, they construct creations from it. An old lady, known as the Grouch, says Steve is too cheap to buy new things and tells the children they will get hurt if they help him. Steve's own injury prompts a promise that the dumpster diving will end, but the children proudly build Steve a wheelchair from trash they have salvaged. One senses that Steve's accident was an editor-initiated ploy to discourage child readers from becoming trash trawlers or to keep adults from rejecting the book. But Dumpster Diver makes the point that salvaging is more fun and creative than buying new, useless crap that will ultimately get thrown out. Here Comes the Garbage Barge exposes the ways in which political corruption and economic incentives interfere with public interest and points to the not in my backyard impulse that makes waste disposal a perennial problem. With artwork made of recycled materials, the book dramatizes the true story of a boat that departed Islip, Long Island, hauling 3,168 tons of garbage on what became a 6-month, 6,000-mile journey. Citizen and government pressure caused the boat to be turned away at every port until it finally returns to Islip to burn and bury the stinking garbage, depicted quite graphically throughout the book in various states of decay. Winter's narrator declares,
Justice!
and the moral is that we shouldn't generate excess waste and expect others to live with our junk. Perhaps most striking in its mix of critique and humor, A Coyote Solstice Tale uses the native figure of the coyote trickster to mock holiday spending and greed, even as it comically acknowledges the temptations of consumerism. Interrupting Coyote's preparations for a solstice feast, a girl, claiming to be a reindeer, shows up at his doorstep. Although not particularly fond of humans, Coyote decides it is rude not to let the girl in and feed her, after which she promptly falls asleep. Trying to return the girl home, Coyote and his friends follow her tracks to the edge of the forest, which ends abruptly at a brightly lit mall. The fascinated animals venture inside on a toboggan to find a sea of enraged holiday shoppers. The book describes the animals huddled together as rough herds of humans rushed by, their arms filled with brightly wrapped boxes and murderous looks in their eyes. Despite his friends' reactions, Coyote fills his cart with useless gadgets intended as gifts, but he is shocked and dismayed when he's told he's supposed to pay for everything. Outside, the girl explains this rampant consumerism inspired her reindeer guise. I'd much rather live in a generous world where everyone knows how to share, she says. After she goes home, the animals return to their feast where they sing and offer a prayer for clean water and air. The book ends with Coyote musing on whether goodwill and peace could be purchased for cash or credit at the mall. Gazing across the snowy sky and the pine forest, he muses,
Probably that place had everything. Where these books critique overconsumption and waste, other stories call our attention to people who cannot afford basic necessities, including a decent place to live. But too often they fail to address underlying causes. The Tooth suggests that sympathy can be a catalyst for actions. On her way to the dentist, Marissa notices a homeless man with, quote, an open shoebox with money inside. On the way home from getting her tooth pulled, Marissa pulls away from her mother and drops her tooth into the man's shoebox.
"Put it under your pillow tonight,
She told the man.
and there will be money there tomorrow.
The book's final sentence is,
Now all I needed was a pillow."
using Marissa's response to evoke compassion for the man on the grate, the book shows that children can recognize social injustices that adults have learned to accept.
More radical books push readers to identify with the poor or to recognize their own privilege. Amber Was Brave, Essie Was Smart takes readers into the world of two sisters whose father is in jail for forging a check after losing his job. With mother off at work most of the time, the girls develop survival strategies and still manage to sing, dance, giggle, and jump on the bed, despite the fact that they are often hungry, afraid, or lonely. Tricycle is narrated from the perspective of a wealthy girl in a Latin American country. From a tree, she watches two poor children, her occasional playmates, take and hide her tricycle. She says nothing but thinks, "My mother always tells me not to leave my toys outside." At lunch, she hears adults talking about the missing tricycle, and someone says, "They're all thieves. They should be shot." The girl runs to her bedroom, hides under the bed, falls asleep there, and when she wakes up, tells her mother, "My tricycle got run over by a big black car, then some men with guns took it away with them. And I don't care because I'm too old for a trike now anyway." That the girl's capacity for empathy surpasses that of adults suggests that lack of caring is a learned response.
It is not a coincidence that both Amber and Essie and Tricycle show poor children living with single mothers. Women are disproportionately the victims of poverty throughout the world. Women are far more likely to work in lower paying fields than men. Recent children's books advocate gender equality, but tend to do so more subtly than books published in the 1970s and 1980s. Unlike Norma Klein and Roy Doty's Girls Can Be Anything, in which a feminist critique is central, contemporary children's books tend to simply assume that girls can be anything. They show girls being anything. If I Ran for President, in this book, 6 children of different ethnicities, 3 boys, 3 girls, describe what they would do if they ran for president. The book's conclusion shows Ashley, an African-American girl, getting sworn in as president. Lane Smith's Madam President stars presidential hopeful Katie, a schoolgirl in a blue and white pantsuit. Like his earlier John Paul, George, and Ben, the book finds comedy in children with oversized ambitions. The humor derives from Katie's partial understanding of the president's job, but not from her gender. Even when contemporary children's literature directly addresses sexism, it tends to do so more subtly. Grace for President doesn't make gender discrimination visible. When Grace Campbell learns that no girl has ever become US president, she decides to run for class president. Her opponent's poster highlights the word man in large letters. However, Grace wins narrowly because she puts in more effort than Thomas. With comparable subtlety, Queen of the Falls tells the story of Annie Edson Taylor, who as a 63-year-old widow in 1901 became the first person to go over Niagara Falls in a barrel and survive. The first man to achieve the same feat did so a full decade later. As Van Allsburg's narrator reports, quote, Americans could not have been more amazed if they'd read a horse had hit a home run or a baby had been elected president. How could anyone, let alone a woman, survive a trip over Niagara Falls? Echoing Van Allsburg's The Widow's Broom, Queen of the Falls critiques sexism without editorializing. The phrase, let alone a woman, registers as condescending. Several recent books address norms of masculinity, but there are too few such titles. Dennis, the title character of David Walliams and Quentin Blake's The Boy in the Dress, inhabits an unconventional masculinity, though the book is careful to avoid a truly radical challenge to gender norms. Echoing Charlotte Zolotow's William's Doll, the protagonist's athletic prowess provides a stereotypically masculine, heteronormative counterbalance to his more feminine inclinations, and it makes sure to let us know that Dennis, quote, had a really big crush on Lisa, end quote, the, quote, most beautiful girl in the school, whom at one point he thinks of as his future wife. Though the book emphasizes Dennis's heterosexuality, it does go further than William's Doll in rejecting heteronormative dress. William wants to play with a doll in a dress. David wants to wear a dress, and he does. Also avoiding a sharply radical challenge to heteronormativity, Harvey Firestein and Henry Cole's Sissy Duckling tries to balance its character's non-stereotypical masculinity with masculine stereotypes, and boy, it's a good thing I didn't forget that. It's on Central Time, I think. And now we return to our regularly scheduled. Elmer's father and other male ducks call him a sissy. He swims away and sets up a new home in an old hollow tree. When his father is wounded by a hunter, Elmer nurses him back to health. For his heroism, Elmer, who's quoted as gay here, wins the love of his father and the acceptance of his community. An area of children's literature in even greater need of development is that supporting lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, and questioning youth. Homosexuals and perceived homosexuals are much more likely than any other U.S. minority to be victims of a hate crime. Despite the fact that many influential editors and authors are gay, LGBTQ literature for children is a relatively recent development. Of course, the much larger body of LGBTQ literature for young adults dates to the late 1960s. Reflecting the growing acceptance of gay marriage, we are witnessing the rise of three new types of LGBTQ stories. What Betsy Bird calls, quote, books with gay characters in them where the entire point of the book is not the fact that the characters are gay. Stories where the parent's sexuality is presented matter-of-factly, and stories that focus on the child's sexuality, formerly a topic reserved for YA novels. Of the first group, Peter Lindenbaum's Minnie Mia and Her Darling Uncle addresses Mia's jealousy of her uncle's new friend, Fergus. After a series of conflicts, by the end of the book, Mia accepts Fergus, and they become friends as well. Of the second type, Leslie Newman's pair of board books, Mommy, Mama, and Me, and Daddy, Papa, and Me, each show, in rhyming couplets, a child spending the day with her or his parents.
Mommy packs a yummy snack. Mama rides me on her back. Daddy helps me paint the sky. Papa helps me bake a pie.
Neither book mentions the parent's sexuality. Unlike the adolescent characters in LGBTQ YA fiction, most children in LGBTQ children's fiction are not themselves gay. Until recently, there are a few works for preteens that now feature characters who, though they may not express desire, are explicitly coded as either gay, transgender, or at least questioning heteronormative behavior. The 4-year-old protagonist of Cheryl Kill Davis's My Princess Boy doesn't simply want to play with a doll. Quote, he dresses up in girly dresses, he dances like a beautiful ballerina. Though some people laugh at him, his family does not. Our princess boy is happy because we love him for who he is. Written by the mother of such a boy, the book affirms the choices of LGBTQ children, a message unfortunately undermined by the bizarre, walnut-headed, faceless people who populate the book. Its aesthetic failures aside, the book eschews the heteronormative emphasis of its predecessors. We don't know whether Princess Boy is gay, transgender, or just likes to dress up. We do know that his parents love him, no matter what. Lois Gould's X, A Fabulous Child Story, introduced Baby X, which sought to teach us that children who grow up without strict gender roles are the most well-adjusted children. In contrast, Marcus Ewart's A Thousand Dresses is explicitly about what it means to be transgender, in a society that expects boys to be masculine and girls to be feminine. The book's protagonist, Bailey, is a boy who identifies as female, and the book consistently refers to Bailey as she. Her family doesn't accept her, but she makes friends with Laurel, who does. The book never finds any resolution within the family, but suggests that transgender children can find friends who will accept them, and affirms their right to express who they are. You probably already know this one, which is one of the best ones, we think. It succinctly rebuts one favorite argument of anti-gay groups, that homosexuality is unnatural. The tale of Silo and Roy shows that birds of the same sex also flock together. And second, in telling us Roy and Silo's story, the book offers another way of normalizing same-sex relationships. Third, the book tells a good story and is compelling to child readers, and thus, I suppose, threatening to would-be censors.
Given their relatively long history in the U.S., books explaining the basic facts of human reproduction might not seem to be particularly radical. They are among the most frequently challenged by would-be censors. The facts of death, disability, depression, or mental illness are even more rare in books for younger readers, because their presence challenges assumptions about children's literature and contemporary childhood.
From Sweden, Pia Lindenbaum's When Owen's Mom Breathed Fire tells of a day when Owen's mother turns into a dragon, a metaphor for her breakdown. Owen compensates for his mother's erratic behavior when he can, but often he cannot. By the book's end, Mom has returned to her ordinary personality. With grace and humor, Lindenbaum guides children through a potentially terrifying experience, the loss of a parent's sanity. Chantan's The Red Tree depicts a child experiencing depression. Quote, sometimes the day begins with nothing to look forward to, and things go from bad to worse. After a series of waking nightmares, she returns to her room, the main character does, where in place of those black leaves you saw, a red tree blooms, and she smiles. Inviting readers to view the world through the eyes of a clinically depressed child helps to convey the conditions of bleak oppressiveness. It's not a matter of just needing to look on the bright side, it's debilitating. From Venezuela, The Black Book of Colors is a picture book for the blind and a tactile experience of seeing for those whose vision is not impaired. On black pages with braille text and white print, the book offers a series of raised illustrations of items associated with the color. For red, which is
sour like unripe strawberries and sweet as watermelon,
you can touch the contours and crevices of strawberries. Many books that encourage young readers to empathize with the mentally ill or with special needs children do not come from the United States, which supports George Nicholson's claim that American publishers shy away from books that violate the conventional norms of children's literature. Though the imagination is in itself neither radical nor conservative, activating the imagination might, as Percy Shelley said of poetry, vital aid to the imagination, herald, quote, the awakening of a great people to work beneficial change in opinion or institution. In other words, in imagining other worlds, children might raise questions about this one. Books from the last decade that foster children's imaginations in arguably radical ways fall into several types. Those in which the imagination literally alters the physical universe, metafictional meditations on narrative, and those that upend conventional assumptions about childhood. In The Pencil, a pencil draws a world and draws a paintbrush to give it color. When the pencil also creates an eraser, the picture book shows us how the imagination can destroy as well as create. Excited by its ability to erase, the eraser rubs out much of the world until the pencil, thinking fast, creates another eraser. As Crockett Johnson's Herald does, the pencil shows us how the imagination can create both possibility and peril. Using the simplest type of meta-picture, duck rabbit, redeploys an image in which figure and ground oscillate, placing the viewer at the center of the experiment. The book never resolves its central question, and that lack of resolution is precisely its point. Perception is inherently subjective. But of course, in the material world, some perceptions have a stronger basis in fact than others, and therein lies the flaw of the metafictional work. As Joe Sutler Sanders has argued, metafictions provide at best a muddled form of subversion. They may prod the reader to think, but how critically?
Several recent children's books feed imagination by upending contemporary children's literature conventions. In contrast to didactic literature from an earlier era, or classic fairy tales by the brothers Grimm or Perrault, in contemporary children's books, we are used to happy endings, good guys winning, and love conquering all. The ugly fish keeps eating every new fish put into his tank, but eventually becomes lonely and decides he will be nice to the new, shiny fish. Unfortunately, shiny fish eats him. Similarly, in Tadpole's Promise, a tadpole and a caterpillar's romance ends abruptly when the tadpole turned frog, looking for his old caterpillar friend, eats the caterpillar turned butterfly for lunch.
In figuring human characters as food, Hush, Little Dragon, and I'd really like to eat a child, likewise play with the notion that children should be protected from that which is fearful. Though imagination may not be inherently radical, it does teach us to improvise, to invent, and to ask questions.
As our earlier work has shown, leftists have long recognized that children are the future.
But, as Michelle Abate's recent book reminds us, so have those on the right.
If there is to be a future governed by social justice, equal opportunities for all, and fair distribution of resources, then that future will begin with children who are willing to question the status quo. Such children will need books that help them to think critically about the world they will inherit, teach them how to consume less and conserve more, show them the power to be gained by organizing, and encourage them to build a better world. But most of all, they need to heed the words of Dr. Seuss's The Lorax.
Unless someone like you cares a whole awful lot, nothing is going to get better. It's not.
Thank you.
I want to give tokens of appreciation to Julia and Phil. I also want to remind you that the annual membership meeting begins at 11:15, but I know you've got a couple of questions, so I'm going to open it up for a few moments, but then membership 11:15 across the Moody cafeteria. But again, thank you so much.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. Thank you for your generous applause. We don't have an encore planned, but as Catherine says, we're happy to entertain questions for a few minutes before we all head off to another meeting. So, please, any questions? Sure, Jeff.
I was going to ask you how, in Canada, organizations like the Ontario Elementary School Teachers Federation have long been promoting this kind of literature with programs like Word, Race, and Prejudice, in which they put together lists like this of radical literature. Presses like Second Story Press and Roundwood have been promoting this material. I don't have, and bookstores like the bookstore that I worked with in Toronto called Another Story Bookshop, which was a social justice bookshop, which has the deepest selection of this kind of material that I know of, are there. What's it like here? My question is, this kind of material is absolutely essential for radicalizing children, but what kind of accessibility do Americans have to this material, especially with the fact that independent bookstores in the US, like in Canada, are fast disappearing?
I mean, there are radical bookstores all over the country, in most, I would say, in most big cities. You can find them still, and they're often volunteer run and nonprofit. And then places like the Cooperative Children's Book Center in Wisconsin with their choices list, and some of the awards that we mentioned are still promoting these kinds of books. My sense is that there may be a little bit more being done in Canada. We did find quite a few books that
Well,
were
Roundwood in particular was
Yeah.
a source of like a third of the list, right?
I think it's, we found plenty when we started looking.
But we think you mean, or I think at least you're right, that availability may vary, and that it does require some.
Knowing the connection between the school system, because that's how, like in Canada, that's one of the ways that these books get into the hands of kids.
Okay.
Because they're actively promoting.
No, I don't think they're being actively promoted. In
No, we hope that those of you who have an interest will go out and do that. I mean, that's sort of.
I think it's harder for American school teachers to do that.
Other question, I know I saw something over here.
I was wondering if you would be posting this bibliography online so that teachers
Yeah, we can do that.
Yeah,
share
me
with
too.
students.
We might even add to
The
it.
lecture is being recorded, so you'll be able to watch it from the Children's Literature Association website.
Right?
Back there?
Is the market for disability kind of studies concept books being developed? Because I remember when I was really excited when I first saw the Black Book of Color, and I was like,
Yeah.
oh, this is really interesting. And I took it to my friend who was blind, and he was like, you do realize that people who were born blind don't understand two-dimensional renderings of three-dimensional objects. It's not actually meaningful to somebody who's born blind. And I was like, right, okay. So then I felt slightly less like I was doing something, empowering. But
And now so do I.
There was the very interesting book about kind of prosthesis, but is that something that you've seen more of, or something that people
We
are?
didn't find a lot of it. We set ourselves a sort of ludicrously ambitious task to survey all of the books that we might consider radical from the last decade. So there's a chance that we missed some. But we honestly didn't find much, is the short answer.
I will say, sort of following up on the other question, the Cooperative Children's Book Center, CCBC, at the University of Wisconsin, they publish lists, and they have on their main webpage lists under certain categories. And I don't recall, but they may have a list of, 40 good books about disability, they'll have 40 good books about peace and justice, and 40 good books about whatever. So that's a great resource.
Sure.
Now that we're in the Obama age, radical could be construed as the right looking for ways to get their messages out and feeling that they're the radicals in our current administration. Have you seen a rise in what I would consider anti-radical books, but in terms of, I saw the one with the gun-toting children there, but has there been a rise in that type of publishing? I'm not really making a judgment, just a question.
It seems to me that there's been a rise, and Michelle Abate can speak to this more directly, but a rise in those sort of books from the right, and that those on the left have continued their long tradition of producing books that counter that kind of thinking. Can you think of anything particularly?
Well, I just finished reading Michelle's book, and she argues that it has been more, beginning more since the 1990s is when this literature started exploding. Although, she makes the point, and others have observed that, much children's literature is very conservative in its values of pressing for the status quo, but more right-wing would be going beyond pressing for the status quo and pressing for a more kind of right-wing agenda. I have not been as impressed by the literary quality of these books, and that's not, I don't want to make that as like my own personal judgment of my own politics, but I haven't seen as many books that are going to be as compelling to child readers. And I don't know if Michelle, if you've seen more. So, but the books are selling well, and you know, so I don't know what that means.
Well, I have a whole host of people here. Just to assume that Obama means radical is wrong. Yes. Arnie Duncan, our education secretary, is out pushing Bush and out spelling spellings. His agenda is test, 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 test.
Right.
And we have to protest this man before Obama gets reelected. There's going to be a march on Washington in late July to reclaim our schools. If you look at the Common Core standards, almost all of their anchor texts are white and middle class, and this is coming from Obama's administration. So we are going to become much more conservative in our schools if we don't get rid of this Arnie Duncan. I don't know like what's going on in Obama's mind. Maybe he's got somebody that he used to worry about that he just handed it to the good old boy to take care of. But I think we are in worse shape than we were in the Bush years with Arnie Duncan. Thank you for my bullet point.
Sure, go ahead. Yes, no, we expect the occasional just comment.
Yeah.
Yeah, over here.
I wonder too whether there are school resources for books in the classroom in the elementary grades, but that tends to drop off, at least in the Philadelphia Public School District, in the high school level. So there are literally no books.
But they're tests.
There are tests and there are readers, and they read 5, 6, 7 pages tops, but not a full book.
Yeah. Well, no, I mean,
And that's the entire Philadelphia.
I mean, there is a whole.
So then they don't see any radical.
Right. Well, and I mean, the larger problem to which you speak is the sort of ongoing assault on children and education in this country in favor of redistributing resources upwards to those who already have resources. So, yeah, I mean, there's a much, beyond getting the books out to children, actually having classes that aren't so huge that teachers can't teach them, actually continuing to employ librarians in libraries. There are even more basic concerns than literature that we face at the moment.
I mean,
So,
the
yeah.
literature is the concern,
Yeah.
but you can't get the literature to any readership if there's no money in the budget
Right.
for even a single book over the
Exactly.
summer,
Yeah.
for a single full book in the classroom.
Yeah.
If that doesn't exist,
Right.
we're focusing on the wrong thing, so absolutely a march.
I think, since we have
I have a
5
letter I
minutes, we should
send to
probably.
Obama every day. If anybody would like it, I'll give it to you.
Thank you all so much for coming. The meeting is adjourned.